Welcome to this very brief introduction to short fiction. I just want to kind of gloss over what is present in the introduction to your anthology, which I think is fantastically written, and I really want you to read it and not just listen to this lecture and think that you've covered it, because I'm not going to go into really any huge depth because I think he does a great job. But what I wanted to start out with is saying that most people feel very comfortable with short stories because you're coming out of poetry and the language is much more familiar and it seems like it's very straightforward and it's not difficult to kind of get a grasp on it. I don't want you to be, how do I say? I don't want you to be under an illusion that everything in a short story is very straightforward. It's not. And you'll see that I'm asking you in paper number 2 to write about the symbolism in a short story. And so what I'm looking for you to do is really kind of, just like I did with the poems, and ask you kind of to dissect them and to look at what's going on underneath the surface. I'm definitely asking you to do the same thing with short stories. I want you to read critically. I want you to really dig into it and find out what it is that you are meant to get out of the story beyond just the plot line. So what I'm going to talk about and what your author talks about here in this introduction is what I want to talk about are the elements of short stories. Just like we talked about the elements of poetry that can help you create a close reading, you're kind of doing a similar thing here, except that it's probably a lot more accessible to you and it probably feels a lot more familiar to you than poetry does. So I'm going to talk about some of these elements, some of the things that you should be thinking about as you're reading and as you're going back to reread, and some of the things that are going to puzzle you and challenge you and ask you to think critically about what the author is doing. The first thing I always want you to consider is point of view. You want to ask yourself a couple of things. What is the narrator's perspective? You really want to figure out who that narrator is. How are they approaching this scene, this scenario, whatever. Sometimes the narrator is going to be a character in the story. And so you have to ask yourself, okay, is this narrator a reliable narrator? Sometimes you're going to find an omniscient narrator, or a narrator who can see everything at the same time. Is that narrator then more reliable? That's kind of a tricky question, and it's something that you really want to consider because this is the person from whom you're getting your information. And so you have to ask yourself, okay, am I getting information that's straightforward? Am I getting information that's skewed a little bit? It doesn't necessarily make the information bad. It just makes it helps you to be informed about how that information is tilted or slanted. The next thing you want to think about is the type of narration that's happening. As fiction sort of developed over time, in the last century, in the 19th century, the very end of the 19th century, and actually really the beginning of the 20th century, there was something that started happening with the way that people played with narration. And this created a kind of different movement towards something called stream of consciousness. And it's a very different kind of narration. And it's very, the best way to describe it is like as if you're in someone's head, inside of someone's head, and you're seeing the world exactly as you see the world. So in the course of your day, I really doubt that you have a very linear way of thinking about things. If you're anything like me, sometimes you'll find yourself starting to think about what's for dinner and ending up thinking about, I don't know, drilling for oil in Alaska, and you think, how on earth did I get from here to there? And you think about all the leapfrog steps that got you there, and if you trace it back, it's not a linear progression. It's this kind of convoluted way of seeing the world. And what these authors wanted to do was sort of capture that. So if you have that kind of narration going on, then of course it's going to be a different kind of scenario for you to try to figure out what the meaning is or what the author's trying to establish. So all of these things are important when you're considering point of view. The next thing to consider are the characters. Probably the characters and your feeling about them and your relationship with them and your opinion of them is going to be at the forefront of your reading experience. And that's fine. As the editor of your anthology mentions, this is a messy kind of process. It's not linear either. So it's fine for you to sort of be angry at a character, and that sort of gets you thinking about character in general. But you want to ask yourself, whether a character is a dynamic character or a static character. And I think there's some confusion here. Dynamic means that fundamentally these characters have changed. From the beginning of the story to the end of the story, they have really changed. A static character hasn't, and that makes sense. Dynamic means moving and changing, and static is stationary. Just because something happens in the story doesn't mean that a character has changed. Just because events occur to them, about them, around them, whatever, doesn't make them a dynamic character. So you have to be really careful about labeling a character a dynamic character unless it's very clear that there have been changes. Big changes, not just, they cut their hair, like serious character level changes. And then you want to think about, okay, who's the protagonist, meaning kind of the hero or the person with whom we're supposed to identify, and who's the antagonist, the person who's causing conflict. You want to kind of get a sense of how, just like you want to know who's telling you the story, you want to get a sense of who is acting out in the story, who is doing the action, and what is their motivation and what's happening to them. Plot, somewhat self-explanatory. I think this is what happens in the story, but it's not just that. It's more than just these are a series of events. It's more than a summary. What you want to think about is what is the conflict? What is going on that is causing the interest in the story, sort of. The rising action, the climax, the resolution, all of these things are part of that whole plot dynamic, the whole plot arc, and you want to be able to identify what is happening and where these elements occur in the story. It will help you to sort of identify what the author is trying to do. Setting can be really instructive sometimes. Why is a story set in a particular place? These are all conscious choices. People don't just, say, hey, let me have it in downtown Baltimore for no good reason at all. No, they're making these choices for a reason, and they're painting you a picture that they want you to see. And your task as a reader, as a critical reader, is to think, okay, why? Why did you put me in downtown Baltimore in 1926? What does that have to do with anything? And so you start asking yourself, okay, well, what's the picture that I get of the neighborhood? What's the picture that I get of the environment? What does that setting do to reflect on a theme, to reflect on something that is going to help me understand what the author is trying to communicate to me? Symbolism. I have an entire lecture about symbolism. I'm not going to talk one little lick about it, except to say watch that lecture. Motifs. Motifs are sort of like symbols, except that they are more, I don't know. The motifs can kind of signal to you the symbolism. They can kind of be like symbols, except usually they don't have as much resonance. Usually a motif is defined as like an image, an object, a character, a situation, a theme, or a word that a writer uses all the time throughout a work. So it doesn't necessarily elevate to the level of symbolism, but you see it over and over and over again. So it can kind of be like a little roadmap to get you to a place where you can understand the symbolism or what the author is trying to communicate to you. And then a theme, which is what the story is about, not in a literal sense, but in the sense of answering the question, what is it that you think that the author is trying to communicate to you? It's the same thing as poetry. I'm asking you to try to figure out what is the deeper meaning in this story. Beyond sort of like the obvious, this is what happens. What is the author trying to communicate to you about the world, about life? There's a message there. There's some kind of message. It may be a terribly depressing message, or it might be a really hopeful message, or it might be something about people in general. It might be something about something specific like war or love or something like that. But to identify the theme is going to help you to be able to figure out the symbolism that's at work, or to figure out what the characters are doing, or to figure out what the purpose of the setting is. All of these things can help you figure out the theme, and once you figure out the theme can help you find all of these elements. It's kind of a reciprocal relationship there. It's a cycle. So I would invite you to be a critical reader. If you're not accustomed to being a critical reader, if you're not accustomed to marking up your book, if you're not accustomed to thinking deeply about something, I'm trying to jar you out of that, because that idea of asking questions, reading, and then writing about it, that's at the heart of true education. That's what I'm asking you to do, is to read something critically, to think about it, to ponder on it, to take a position, and to defend that position. And I think that's, even if you're an electrical engineer, that's not going to be foreign to your experience. You're going to have to assess a situation. You're going to have to look at it critically, ask questions, figure out the answer, and then defend that answer, whatever that answer may be. So this is one way to do it, and it also gives you practice in writing. I hope that all of you have watched the Intro to Argumentative Structure lecture. If you haven't, I would invite you and encourage you, and even I wish I could compel you, but I can't, to watch that. It tells you exactly what I'm looking for in terms of your writing. So I'm looking for your writing structure first and your content second, but if you can marry those two together, it's going to be much better, much more interesting to read, and much more engaging to write as well. So that's a really brief rundown of short stories. You should feel fairly familiar with this. Everybody's done their share of short story reading. If you've gone through high school, which I know you have because you're here, then you've done this. So it's just a matter of becoming more conscious about how you're doing it and what you're looking for, and paying attention beyond the literal, looking critically at what's going on. So let me know if you have questions. Otherwise, enjoy your time in the short stories that we read.